The bull he bought alone. On the second Saturday of April 1985, a bull walked into the auction ring at the Sedalia Livestock Barn, and the room went quiet. Not the polite quiet of men paying attention. The held-breath quiet of men who understood they were looking at something exceptional. The animal was pale cream, almost white, heavy with muscle across the shoulders and hindquarters, moving with the particular authority of a bull that has spent years becoming exactly what it was meant to be. The auctioneer called the opening bid at $8,000, and hands went up across the barn before the number had finished leaving his mouth. 9, 10, 12, 15. The Texas buyer in the front row called $15,000, and the barn went quiet again. A different quiet this time, the quiet of a number settling into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Sold. In the back row, a man named Harlan DeWitt made a small note in the margin of his sale catalog. He did not smile. He did not look around the barn to see who was watching. He wrote the number down with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, and then he looked up at the ring where his bull was being led out by the handlers, and something moved across his face that was not quite satisfaction and not quite pride, but lived in the territory between them. 14 years. That was the distance between this moment and the moment that had made it possible. 14 years between a skinny, cream-colored bull that a room full of men had laughed at and the animal that had just sold for more money than most farms in Pettis County were worth. 14 years of early mornings and careful records and the patient accumulation of something that everyone around him had been certain was a mistake. 14 years of knowing something that nobody else knew and keeping it to himself and letting the truth do what truth does when you give it enough time and enough ground. But to understand where this day came from, you have to go back further than the auction barn. You have to go back to a letter that arrived in October of 1968, written in careful English by a man in Burgundy, France, who understood what was coming before almost anyone in America had thought to look. Harlan DeWitt was born in 1924 on a farm outside Sedalia, Missouri, and he had been farming the same county ground for his entire adult life. He was not a man who drew attention to himself. He was not the loudest voice at the co-op or the most opinionated presence at the feed store. He was a man of the kind of quietness that gets mistaken for simplicity by people who do not look carefully, and most people did not look carefully at Harlan DeWitt. What they saw was a cattle farmer of modest size running a small Hereford operation on land that was good but not exceptional, producing calves that were adequate but not remarkable, living the kind of life that the farming communities of central Missouri produced in abundance and noticed only when it ended. He was 44 years old in 1968 when the letter arrived, and he had been doing things more or less the same way for 20 years, and there was no particular reason for anyone who knew him to expect that anything was about to change. The letter came from his cousin, Marcel Fontenot. Marcel's mother had been Harlan's mother's sister, a woman who had married a Frenchman after the First World War and moved to a village in the Burgundy region where she had lived for the rest of her life. Harlan had never met Marcel in person. They had exchanged letters occasionally over the years, the way distant relatives do when geography makes everything else impossible, and the letters had been pleasant and unremarkable. The correspondence of two men who shared blood and little else. Until October of 1968, Marcel worked for a livestock cooperative in France, helping to manage breeding programs for several large cattle operations. He was not a farmer himself, but he understood the industry from the inside, understood the bloodlines and the market dynamics and the slow movements of agricultural change that took years to become visible from the outside. And in October of 1968, he wrote Harlan a letter that was 5 pages long and handwritten in the careful English of a man who had learned the language as an adult and used it precisely. The letter described a breed of cattle called Charolais. Marcel explained it the way a man explains something he has been watching develop for years and has been waiting for the right moment to share. The Charolais had been bred in France for centuries, primarily in the Charolais and Nivernais regions, selected over generations for the qualities that French cattle farmers valued. They were large animals, pale in color, lean in their musculature, in a way that looked wrong to eyes trained on the blocky compactness of Hereford and Angus cattle. They looked, Marcel wrote, like animals that had not finished growing or animals that were not quite well. To someone who only knew traditional American breeds, the first impression was almost always wrong. But the numbers told a different story. Charolais cattle converted feed into muscle more efficiently than almost any other breed. They gain in weight faster, reach market size sooner, and produce leaner meat with a higher carcass, yield more sellable beef per pound of live weight, less fat and waste. The packers, who process beef for the American market, were beginning to understand what that meant in practical terms. The industry was moving slowly and without announcement toward exactly the qualities that this breed had been selected for over centuries. The breed was rare in America, a few thousand head in the whole country, mostly in Canada and Texas. The bloodlines tightly controlled the animals expensive for those who understood what they were looking at. A proven Charolais bull with documented breeding history could sell for $5,000, sometimes more. Marcel wrote what he believed was coming. In 10 years, maybe 15 Charolais genetics will be everywhere in America. The cattlemen will crossbreed them with Herefords and Angus to improve the entire American beef herd. The people who control the bloodlines now, who have been building programs while the breed is still rare and undervalued, will be positioned in ways that others will spend years trying to catch up to. And then the sentence that Harlan read more times than any other in the 5 pages. Watch for Charolais at your local auctions. Most American cattlemen do not recognize them yet. They see a pale, lean animal and think it is sick or stunted. If you can find one at a low price, if you can start building a breeding program before everyone else understands what they are looking at, you could be sitting on something very valuable. Harlan read the letter twice the evening it arrived, sitting at the kitchen table after supper, while Cora washed the dishes and the radio played something neither of them was listening to. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in the desk drawer in the bedroom. He did not mention it to Cora. This was not because he did not trust her. He trusted Cora more than anyone alive. They had been married for 22 years, and she knew things about him that he did not know about himself, and he knew the same about her, and the marriage had the particular quality that long marriages develop when both people are honest, a kind of bedrock knowledge of each other that functioned better than any formal agreement. He did not mention the letter because he was not yet certain about what it contained. He had the instinct of a man who has been farming for 20 years, the instinct that recognized something worth paying attention to, but instinct was not enough. He needed to know whether Marcel was right before he said anything to anyone, including his wife. He wrote back to Marcel asking for more information. Marcel's reply in December was longer than the first letter. It went deeper into the genetics, explained the history of the breed in France, described the specific characteristics that made Charolais crosses valuable to commercial packers. Harlan read it several times. He wrote to the American International Charolais Association in Kansas City and received a packet of materials that confirmed what Marcel had said. He subscribed to 2 livestock magazines that covered breed trends and read them cover to cover. He talked to a veterinarian in Kansas City, a man named Dr. Whitmore, who had traveled to Canada and seen Charolais operations firsthand, and everything Dr. Whitmore said aligned with everything Marcel had written. He spent 3 years doing this research before he spent a dollar. The money he was saving over those 3 years was accumulating in a coffee can at the back of the tool shelf in the barn, added to in small amounts as the farm produced small surpluses. $1 here and $5 there, growing with the patience of a man who understands that preparation and opportunity arrive in that order and not the other way around. By the spring of 1971, there was $600 in the coffee can. Cora did not know about the coffee can. He knew when he thought about it honestly that this was the one part of the plan that was not entirely straight. She would have understood. She would have supported it, or she would have had questions that were worth answering, and either outcome would have been reasonable. But Harlan had a quality that his father had also had: a reluctance to share things before they were ready, a belief that half-formed plans were better kept than offered, that you did not show people the seed and expect them to see the tree. He would tell her when there was something to tell. His father had said something to him once sitting on the porch on a summer evening when Harlan was maybe 16 years old, in the easy conversational way that fathers sometimes say the things they most want their sons to carry forward. His father had said that when a man knows something that other men do not know, he has 2 choices. He can share it and watch them argue with him, doubt him, maybe learn from him and become his competition. Or he can stay quiet, let them think what they think, and keep the advantage for himself. Neither choice is wrong, his father had said, but know which one you are making and make it on purpose. Harlan had made it on purpose. The Sedalia livestock auction held its spring sale on the second Saturday of April. And Harlan drove his pickup and cattle trailer 40 miles from his farm in the early morning. The county roads empty at that hour, the Missouri spring not yet fully committed, the fields still carrying the faint brown of a winter that had not entirely released its claim. He arrived before the sale started and found a seat in the back row away from the clusters of men who had gathered near the ring, and along the walls the comfortable groupings of farmers who had been doing business at this barn for decades and knew each other with the uncomplicated familiarity of shared experience. Harlan was not unfamiliar to these men. He had been coming to this auction for 20 years, but he wanted the back row this morning, the vantage point where he could see everything without being seen looking at anything in particular. The barn had the smell that livestock auction barns always have, the layered smell of hay and animals, and coffee and cigarette smoke, and the particular human smell of men who have been up since before dawn doing physical work. It was a spring sale calving season, and farmers from 3 counties had come to buy and sell breeding stock. The seats were full, and the standing room along the walls was occupied, the pre-sale murmur filling the barn with the continuous low sound of men talking cattle. Harlan watched the lots come through. Hereford bulls with the thick necks and solid compact frames that Pettis County cattlemen recognized and valued, the kind of animals that had been proving themselves in Missouri pastures for generations. Black Angus cows, heavy with calf, moving through the ring with the deliberate weight of animals that knew their own value. A few dairy animals that drew politely declining interest. The bidding was active and confident, the prices reflecting the spring optimism that always accompanied breeding season, when the potential of the coming year was still intact and the failures of the coming year had not yet arrived. Most bulls were selling between $300 and $500. The premium animals, the ones with documented bloodlines and multiple generations of performance records, occasionally pushed above $800. The room understood these prices. The room had been calibrating this market for decades, and it moved through the familiar ranges with the efficiency of long practice. Then Lot 47 came into the ring. The animal that entered was wrong in every way that the room understood rightness. Where the Herefords were red and white and built like the compact agricultural machinery they had been bred to be, this animal was pale, almost the color of old cream, with a pinkish tint to the skin visible through the light coat. Where the Angus and Herefords filled the space of the ring with their blocky authority, this animal was lean, almost rangy, long in the body, with a narrow head and hip bones that jutted with a visibility that to the eyes of every experienced cattleman in the barn looked like exactly one thing: sickness. The auctioneer looked at his paperwork with the expression of a man who has accepted uncertainty as a professional condition. He announced the lot number. He said the animal was a young bull, approximately 18 months of age. He squinted at the breed designation and attempted the French word and produced something that was more Missouri than Burgundy, and he said it was a French breed, and he said he would start the bidding at $100. The barn was quiet in a different way now. The active, interested quiet of the previous lots had become the waiting quiet of a room that has decided collectively it is not interested. $100, the auctioneer said. A breeding age bull. Let's see some hands. Nothing. All right. $50. Who will give me 50? In the back row, Harlan DeWitt raised his hand. The auctioneer acknowledged the bid with a professional reflexiveness of a man who takes all bids and immediately asked for 60. The question went into the air and stayed there. A farmer in the front row turned around to see who had bid $50 on the pale, skinny bull, and the expression that moved across his face was the compound expression of confusion, followed by recognition, followed by amusement. Harlan could feel the attention shifting toward him, the subtle physics of a room when it decides to look at something. 60, anyone, nothing. He raised his hand again. 75. The auctioneer paused. Sir, he said, you are bidding against yourself. I know, Harlan said. $75. The low murmur of conversation had stopped. The barn had achieved the quality of attention that comes when something unexpected has happened, and the room has not yet decided what to make of it. Men were turning in their seats. Men who had been leaning against the far wall were straightening. And that was when Burl Stanwyck stood up. Burl Stanwyck was the John Deere dealer in Sedalia. He had been for 15 years, having inherited the business from his father-in-law when the old man's health made the handover necessary and profitable for everyone involved. He was a large man, 45 years old, with the particular kind of bulk that accumulates in men who eat well and do not do much physical labor. A red face and a voice calibrated for rooms larger than the ones he usually occupied. He knew cattle. He had grown up on a cattle farm and had carried that credential into every conversation about agriculture that he had engaged in since, which was most conversations because Burl Stanwyck had opinions about everything and the confidence to deploy them without regard for invitation. He was also a man who understood audiences. He had the gift of the phrase that reduced complicated things to simple ones, and the instinct for the moment when a room was ready to laugh if the right person gave it permission. He stood up. He turned to face the barn. He raised his voice so the back row could hear. He said Harlan DeWitt had better dig that grave now, while the ground was soft because that animal would not see July. The barn erupted, not a polite chuckle, not the restrained amusement of men in a professional setting. The full laughter of a room that has been given exactly what it wanted. The communal release of shared recognition. The laughter of men who have been certain of something and have now been given the gift of someone making that certainty entertaining. Burl was not finished. He said he would sell Harlan a shovel at cost. He said the bull had one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel. He was performing now, playing to the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing this his entire adult life, reading the room's appetite and feeding it with the confidence of someone who has never been uncertain about his own authority. Preston Yates, the banker from First National, who was sitting near the front, offered that Harlan could at least get some warmth from lighting $75 on fire because that pale animal was only going to produce vet bills and a burial expense. Tom Denton, a neighbor whose farm sat 2 miles east of Harlan's, shouted from the middle rows that the skinny thing might be a dairy bull. The room laughed harder. Someone called out that the French breed might be good for making fancy cheese. The whole barn was performing now a collective improvisation, each addition to the joke drawing encouragement from the laughter of the men around it. The auctioneer was trying to maintain the procedural momentum of a professional event while failing to entirely suppress his own smile. The ring handlers had given up pretending to be impartial. Harlan DeWitt stood in the back row with his bid number in his hand. He did not argue. He did not explain. He did not defend himself or the animal or the research he had done or the letter from Burgundy that had been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper was beginning to wear through at the creases. He did not mention Marcel or the American Carolet Association or the Kansas City veterinarian who had seen these animals in Canada and understood what they were. He stood in the back row and waited for the laughter to finish. Then he walked to the clerk's window. He paid $75. He collected his receipt. He walked through the parking lot to where his cattle trailer was backed against the loading chute, and he waited while the handlers brought the pale young bull down the chute and into the trailer, and he checked the latch on the trailer gate with the same attention he would have given any piece of equipment he was responsible for, and he got in his truck. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the barn was still audible through the closed windows. Burl Stanwyck's voice carried above the others, sized for an audience. Dead by July. You heard it here first. Harlan drove north on the county road toward home. He was not angry. Anger was not the thing he felt, and he examined what he did feel with the honest attention of a man who prefers accuracy to comfort. What he felt was the particular clarity that comes when you have made a decision you cannot unmake, and the making of it has settled something that needed settling. The laughter behind him was not evidence that he was wrong. It was evidence that he was early. These were different things. His father's voice was in his head on the drive home, the porch conversation from 30 years ago. The two choices, the advantage kept, the silence chosen on purpose. He had stayed quiet in that barn, not because he could not think of a response, not because he was too slow or too humble or too uncertain of himself. He had stayed quiet because explaining the letter from France to a room full of men who were already laughing was not a strategy that produced good outcomes for Harlan DeWitt. If he told them what he knew, some of them would dismiss it, and some of them would look into it themselves, and either way he would have turned a private advantage into a public one that belonged to everyone. He kept the advantage. The farm appeared on the left side of the road, the White House and the red barn, and the fields that had been in his family long enough that they had become indistinguishable from the family itself. And Harlan turned down the gravel lane and pulled the truck around to the barn side and backed the trailer against the gate of the holding pen. He unloaded the bull and stood at the fence for a moment, watching the young animal move through the unfamiliar space, assessing the new ground with the particular caution of something that has been moved and is recalibrating. The pale coat caught the late morning light. The animal was thin, still growing into the frame that the breed promised. But Harlan had read enough and studied enough to see past the present condition to the future one. He named the bull Blanc, the French word for white. He went inside for lunch. Cora was at the stove when he came through the back door, and she looked at him with the alert attention of a wife who has learned to read her husband's returns from auction days, the calculation of what has been bought and at what price and whether the price was wise. She asked what he had brought home. He said a French breed, a Charolais. She came to the window that looked toward the holding pen, and she looked at the pale young bull standing in the pen, and she was quiet for a moment with the quality of quiet that meant she was processing something against her existing understanding of what cattle were supposed to look like. He looks sick, she said. He is not sick, Harlan said. He is just different. Cora turned from the window and looked at her husband with the look that wives give when they understand that something is not being said, but decide for reasons of their own not to push. The look that acknowledges a decision without endorsing it. $75, Harlan said. She was quiet another moment. One could have been put toward the kitchen stove. It could have been, Harlan agreed. Cora shook her head and turned back to the stove, and the subject was closed for the day, though both of them understood it was not closed in any permanent way. The neighbors came within the week. News traveled the way news traveled in farming communities, through the co-op and the feed store, and the road that ran past the front of the DeWitt property, and the story of the skinny French bull that Harlan DeWitt had paid $75 for, while the whole auction barn laughed, was exactly the kind of story that such communities received and circulated with enthusiasm. Ned Coulter stopped his truck at the fence line 3 days after the auction, leaning out the window, with the easy familiarity of a man who considers proximity to constitute a relationship. Still alive, he said. You are already past Glenn's deadline. July wasn't at Harlan was in the far end of the field, and he waved without stopping what he was doing. What are you feeding him, Ned called. Looks like he needs about 50 pounds of grain a day to catch up to a real bull. Harlan kept working. Word went around that the DeWitt farm had acquired the sickest bull in 3 counties. The jokes were not malicious exactly. They had the particular quality of community humor that is more about self-congratulation than cruelty, the pleasure a group takes in being collectively right about something. Harlan DeWitt had done a foolish thing at the Sedalia auction, and the community was noting it in the way that communities note things with repetition and embellishment and the steady pressure of shared certainty. Harlan noted the noting and continued what he was doing. In June, Dr. Clifton Marsh came out for the regular herd check. He was 50 years old, a large, deliberate man who had been the veterinarian of choice in this part of Pettis County for 2 decades, and he moved through the herd with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done the same examination 10,000 times. He checked the Herefords with the routine attention of familiarity. Then he came to the holding pen, where Blank was kept separate from the main herd, and he stopped. He stepped into the pen. He ran his hands along the pale hide, checking the animal, the way a careful veterinarian checks an animal he has not examined before, thorough and systematic. He checked the teeth and the eyes and the hooves and the overall condition. Then he stood back. This is a Charolais, he said, and Harlan heard something in his voice that he had not heard from anyone else in the weeks since the auction. Recognition, the particular register of a man who knows what he is looking at. Where did you find him? Sedalia auction. How much? $75. Dr. Marsh was quiet for a moment. He looked at the animal with the expression of someone revising an estimate upward. Do you know what you have here? I know, Harlan said. Most people would not. Most people would look at this animal and see exactly what everyone at the auction saw. I know what they saw. Dr. Marsh finished his examination and came back to the fence where Harlan was standing and looked at him with an expression that carried both admiration and something more calculating, the expression of a man who has recognized an opportunity adjacent to someone else's. You are planning to breed him when he is ready. A year, maybe a little more. Keep him healthy. Keep him away from disease vectors. Dr. Marsh nodded slowly. If this animal lives up to his genetics, you could have something that this county has not seen before. He paused. Do not tell anyone, not yet. Let them keep thinking he is a failure. Let them keep laughing. Harlan looked at him. "That is the plan," he said. Dr. Marsh picked up his bag and walked back to his truck, and at the edge of the property, he turned and looked back at the pale bull standing in the Missouri sunlight, and he shook his head in the way that men shake their heads when they are impressed by something they did not expect to be impressed by. Harlan watched him drive away. Then he went back to work. The summer passed and Blank did not die in July the way Burl Stanwyck had promised. He did not die in August either, or September, or in the long Missouri fall that followed. He grew. Slowly at first, the way young bulls grow when they are still becoming what they are going to be, and then faster as the winter protein went into the frame that the breed had designed. By the following spring, the animal that had entered Harlan's holding pen as a pale, skinny yearling was beginning to look like something else entirely. Ned Coulter drove past in March and slowed his truck and looked at the bull in the pasture for a long moment before accelerating again without comment. This was itself a kind of acknowledgement. Ned Coulter had never driven past a DeWitt animal without having something to say about it. Harlan noted the silence and added it to the record he was keeping in his own mind, the patient accumulation of evidence that was building towards something he could not yet fully see, but could feel in the way a farmer feels a season coming, the particular weight of the air before something changes. He kept the bulls separated. He kept the records. He fed the grain and checked the water, and walked the pastures the way he had always walked them, with the unremarkable consistency of a man whose reliability is so complete that it has become invisible. Burl Stanwyck's prediction lives somewhere in the community's memory, referenced occasionally at the co-op, with the slightly diminishing confidence of a joke that has been waiting for its punchline for too long. Dead by July. You heard it here first. July had come and gone, and the pale bull that nobody had wanted for $50 was standing in a Pettis County pasture, growing into something that only one man in the county understood, eating his feed and doing what bulls do, patient and indifferent to the opinions of the men who had laughed at his purchase price on a spring morning in 1971. Patient in the way that the truth is patient, waiting for the years to pass. The winter of 1972 arrived in Pettis County with the particular severity that Missouri winters produced every several years, the kind that reminded farmers why they had built their barns facing south and their windbreaks facing north, the kind that tested everything that had been prepared and found everything that had not. Harlan had been watching Blank through the fall with the attention he brought to anything whose value he understood better than anyone around him. The bull had continued to develop through the summer and into the autumn, the frame filling in the way Marcel had described in his letters, the lean musculature of the breed building itself out of the Missouri grass and the supplemental grain Harlan was careful to provide. By October, the animal was beginning to look less like a question and more like an answer. Then in the second week of November, the bull's temperature climbed. It was not dramatic at first. Animals ran fevers. It was part of farming, and Harlan did not alarm himself at the first indication. But he watched carefully, checking twice daily, standing at the fence of the holding pen in the gray November light, noting what he saw with the precision he brought to all observation. By the fourth day, the fever had not broken. By the seventh day, the animal was off his feed. He called Dr. Marsh. Marsh came out the following morning and examined the bull with the thoroughness that Harlan had come to rely on, and found an infection bacterial treatable with the medications that were available, but requiring close monitoring and consistent care over what would likely be several weeks. He was direct about the situation. The animal was not in immediate danger if the treatment was administered correctly and consistently. But Blank was going to need attention that went beyond what the daily farm routine provided. After Marsh drove away, Harlan stood at the fence for a while, looking at the pale bull in the holding pen, the animal standing with the slightly diminished posture of something that is fighting something internal, and he did the arithmetic of the situation with the honesty the situation required. He had $75 in the animal. He had 3 years of research and preparation behind the $75. He had a breeding program that existed entirely in his own plans and had not yet produced a single result. And he had a sick bull in a Missouri November that was going to require him to be present in ways that the rest of the farm also required him to be present. He went inside and told Cora the bull was sick. She asked what that meant. He said it meant he was going to be in the barn more than usual for the next few weeks. He said it meant the morning and evening checks were going to be longer. He said he needed to make sure someone was monitoring the temperature consistently through the night on the worst nights when the fever tended to climb. Cora listened to this. She was quiet in the way she was quiet when she was thinking something through rather than when she had nothing to say. Then she said she would take the middle of the night checks. He looked at her. She said she was a lighter sleeper than he was anyway, and she would hear the alarm better. She said she would wake him if anything changed in a way that required his judgment. She said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing a practical arrangement, not a sacrifice, not a demonstration, just the most efficient solution to a logistical problem. Harlan said nothing for a moment. He understood that Cora had not been told the full reasoning behind the $75 purchase. He had told her it was a French breed and that it would be worth more than it could, and she had accepted this with the particular trust of a woman who has been married long enough to know the difference between her husband's hunches and his certainties, and who has learned to give his certainties room to prove themselves. She had not been given the letter. She had not been given the 3 years of research, the letters to the Charolais Association, the conversation with Dr. Whitmore in Kansas City. She was offering to get up in the middle of Missouri November nights to check on an animal whose value she understood only in outline because her husband had bought it and it needed watching. He told her he appreciated it. She said she would set the alarm for 2. The next 3 weeks passed in the rhythm that illness imposes on a household, the compressed attention of people managing something uncertain. The small victories of a stable temperature, followed by the setbacks of a climbing one. The mornings when the animal stood straight and ate, and the mornings when he stood at the back of the pen with the withdrawn quality of something that is conserving what it has. Harlan found Cora at the holding pen fence on a morning in the 3rd week in the early dark before the farm day, properly started her coat over her nightgown, her breath visible in the cold air. She was looking at the bull with the particular concentrated attention of someone who has been watching something long enough to start forming opinions about it. He stood beside her at the fence. She said the fever had been lower in the 2 o'clock check than it had been the evening before. He said that was a good sign. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked him to tell her about the letter from France. He had known this was coming. He had known it from the moment she set the 2 o'clock alarm, had understood that a woman who committed to waking in the middle of winter nights to check an animal she did not fully understand was a woman who had earned the explanation behind the animal. He had been preparing himself for the conversation without consciously acknowledging that he was preparing. He told her about Marcel. He told her about the letter, the 5 pages in careful English, the breed description, the market analysis, the prediction about where Charolais genetics were going in American cattle farming over the next decade and a half. He told her about the research he had done over 3 years to verify what Marcel had written. He told her about the Charolais Association and the livestock magazines and Dr. Whitmore in Kansas City. He told her about the coffee can on the tool shelf in the barn. She was quiet for a longer time than he expected. Then she said she had wondered about the can. He said he should have told her sooner. She said yes, he should have. She said this without anger, with the kind of directness that long marriages make possible, the ability to name a thing accurately without needing to construct damage around it. Then she said she understood why he had not, which was not the same as saying it had been the right choice. They stood at the fence a while longer in the early dark, looking at the pale bull, who was standing straighter this morning than he had stood in 2 weeks, the fever breaking its hold by degrees, the animal beginning to find its way back to what it had been. By the end of November, Blanc had fully recovered. Harlan noted the recovery in the records. He kept the date and the final temperature reading and the notation that the treatment had been completed. He also noted in the same record the 3 weeks of monitoring that had preceded the recovery, the consistent twice-daily checks the middle of the night, visits, the careful administration of the medications on the schedule Dr. Marsh had prescribed. He did not write Cora's name in the record. The record was functional, not commemorative. But he thought about what the 3 weeks had meant and what she had given to it without being asked, and he filed it in the part of himself where he kept the things that mattered most and did not require words. Blanc was ready to breed in the spring of 1973. Harlan had selected 3 Hereford cows for the first breeding season with the care he brought to all decisions that could not easily be undone. He wanted the best frames, the best fertility, history, the cows that had produced the most consistent calves over the most seasons. He wanted the first generation of crosses to make the strongest possible case for what he was building, because he understood that the first results would be the ones that either confirmed or contradicted everything he had bet the past 5 years on. The breeding was quiet. The calves were born in January and February of 1974, and they did not look like any calves that Pettis County had seen before. They were pale, the Charolais white, mixing with a Hereford red to produce a washed-out tan or cream color that looked to eyes trained on the traditional breeds like something had gone wrong. They were longer in the body than Hereford calves, narrower in the head, with the lean musculature of their sire visible even at a few weeks old. They did not look like the compact, blocky calves that Pettis County valued. Ned Coulter saw them in March. He stopped his truck at the fence line with the reliable timing of a man who has made a habit of the route, leaned out his window and looked at the calves in the pasture with the expression of a man who is genuinely troubled by what he sees. He asked what had happened to Harlan's calves. He said they looked sick. He said they looked like something had drained the color out of them. He said Harlan should call Dr. Marsh. Dr. Marsh has seen them, Harlan said, and they are healthy. Ned looked at the calves again with the particular skepticism of a man whose certainty about something has been contradicted and has not yet accepted the contradiction. They do not look healthy, Ned said. They look different, Harlan said. Different and healthy are not the same thing. Ned shook his head with the resigned expression of a man doing his civic duty by noting something concerning and being ignored. Your funeral, he said, and drove on. Harlan watched him go. That fall, he took the first Charolais cross calves to the Sedalia market. He did not tell anyone what to expect. He did not tell anyone what the calves were or where the unusual coloring and conformation came from. He loaded them in the trailer and drove them to the auction and put them in the holding pen with the same unremarkable routine he had always brought to market days. The cattle buyer from Kansas City was a man named Garvey, a buyer for one of the large packing companies who had been working this territory for years and who had the quick, accurate eye of a man whose living depended on seeing things correctly the first time. Garvey walked the holding pens before the sale started the way buyers did, assessing the lots available before the competition of the auction ring formalized the prices. He stopped at Harlan's calves. He walked around them. He looked at them from the side, from behind, crouching to examine the hindquarter development in the frame structure. He stood up and looked at Harlan, who was standing nearby with the patient expression of someone who has been waiting for this moment without appearing to wait. These are Charolais crosses, Garvey said. That is right, Harlan said. First ones I have seen at this market, Garvey said. He walked around the calves again. Lean, good frame, long body. These are going to dress out beautifully. High yield, less waste, exactly what the processing side is looking for. He named a price. It was 15% above what ordinary Hereford calves were bringing at the Sedalia market that day. Harlan did not smile. He did not look around to see if anyone was watching, did not look for Ned Coulter or any of the men who had been telling him for 2 years that his pale calves looked sick and would not bring 10 cents at market. He nodded, he collected his payment, he drove home. That winter, he bred blank to 6 more cows. The next fall, he took the second round of crosses to market and got the same premium, and the fall after that, a larger premium as Garvey's company became more interested in what the DeWitt calves were consistently producing and began specifically seeking them out at the beginning of each market day. Word moved through the professional buyer network the way professional information moves quietly and specifically, reaching the people for whom it was useful and not going much further. Harlan watched the numbers accumulate in the record book he kept in the desk drawer and said nothing about them to anyone who did not need to know. By 1977, he understood clearly enough to be certain that Pierre had been right. Not approximately right, precisely right. The Charolais market was developing exactly as the letters had described the breed, moving from rare import to recognized commercial asset. The crossbreeding programs multiplying as cattlemen discovered what the packers had already understood. Documented genetics bulls with traceable bloodlines reaching back to original French imports were becoming more valuable than he had fully anticipated even after 3 years of research. Blank was 6 years old in 1977, and his oldest male offspring were mature enough to breed. The first bull Harlan sold that spring went to a rancher from Kansas named Howard Krebs, who had driven 300 miles after reading about Charolais genetics in a livestock magazine and asking around the industry about who in Missouri had documented bloodlines. Howard walked Harlan's pastures with the assessment of a man who has driven 300 miles and wants to be sure the drive was worth it. He examined the animals, asked questions about birth weights and feed conversion, and the documentation that certified the bloodline tracing to the original French imports. "You have the real thing here," Howard said. "Documented Charolais, traceable to French bloodlines." "Do you know how rare that is in this part of the country?" "I know," Harlan said. "Where did you get the foundation?" "Sire Sedalia auction," Harlan said. Howard looked at him. How much? Harlan paused for a fraction of a second that was purely for effect. $75, he said. Howard Krebs laughed. Not the mocking laughter of the auction barns 6 years earlier. The delighted laughter of a man who understands a deal when he hears the history of one, the laughter of someone who appreciates the architecture of a plan well executed. $75, Howard said. "And now you are selling his sons for $1,200. It seems that way." Howard shook his head with the head shaking of genuine admiration and paid the $1,200 and loaded his new bull in the trailer he had brought from Kansas and drove away satisfied. Harlan stood in the yard after the Kansas truck disappeared down the county road and allowed himself briefly and privately the satisfaction that he had been keeping in reserve for 6 years. Then he went back to work. The operation grew in the steady way that operations grow when they are built on something real. By 1978, he had expanded the Charolais breeding program to 30 head. By 1980, he was selling 5 or 6 bulls a year at prices that ranged from $2,000 to $5,000 depending on the animal's conformation and the completeness of its bloodline documentation. He had sold the original Hereford herd entirely and converted the whole operation to registered Charolais. His reputation was moving ahead of him through the regional network of serious cattlemen, the quiet word-of-mouth recommendation that means more in a specialized market than any advertisement, and buyers were coming to him from 3 states without being solicited. The neighbors noticed. In farming communities, prosperity is visible before it is discussed. The new equipment, the improved facilities, the quality of the herd visible from the county road as you drove past. Pettis County had been watching the DeWitt operation for a decade with the particular mixture of puzzlement and suspicion that communities bring to a neighbor whose success they do not understand and were therefore initially not inclined to credit. By the early 1980s, the success was too visible and too sustained to sustain the skepticism. Ned Coulter was the first to come asking. He drove down the DeWitt Lane on a fall morning in 1982 and found Harlan at the barn, and he approached with the careful positioning of a man who knows he is standing in a complicated spot relative to his own history. Ned was a practical man, and his practicality had overcome whatever else he might have felt about the conversation he needed to have. He said he had been watching the Charolais operation. He said the market was clearly taking off, and he had been reading about it. He said he was wondering about buying a breeding bull, about getting some of those genetics into his own herd. Harlan looked at his neighbor for a long moment. He thought about the fence line, the truck stopping regularly over the years, the comments delivered from the window, the sick calves commentary, the steady, confident notes in the community's shared judgment about the pale French bull and what it was going to cost Harlan DeWitt. He said he sold bulls at the spring sale. He said Ned was welcome to bid like everyone else. Ned said he was hoping maybe Harlan could give him a neighbor discount. He said they went back a long way. "We do go back a long way," Ned Harlan said. "I remember every mile of it." He did not offer the discount. Ned paid the market price at the spring sale the following year and got a good animal, and his operation benefited from it, and he never raised the subject of the discount or the fence line commentary again. This was probably the closest thing to a resolution the situation would ever receive, and Harlan accepted it as adequate. The farm crisis arrived in Missouri in the early 1980s like a tide that did not announce itself until it was already at the door. Interest rates had been climbing for years, and now they were at heights that made the debt loads of expanded operations ruinous, and commodity prices had declined to meet the interest rates coming the other way, and the combination was doing to the Missouri farming what such combinations always did, stripping away the margin that had seemed sustainable when the numbers were moving differently. Farms that had expanded on optimism were discovering that optimism was not collateral. Harlan's operation was not immune to the economic weather of the period, but the Charolais breeding program occupied a different market position than commodity grain or undifferentiated cattle. The premium genetics commanded prices that did not move with the commodity markets in the same way. Buyers who needed specific bloodlines paid for them, regardless of what corn was doing, because the value of a registered Charolais bull with a documented lineage was not derived from the commodity market, but from the breeding market, which operated on different fundamentals. He watched the crisis move through Pettis County from the position of someone standing slightly outside its primary path, not untouched, but not broken. He watched Burl Stanwyck's John Deere dealership from a greater distance. Burl had been running the dealership with the confidence of a man who had inherited a successful business and had mistaken inheritance for capability. The good years of the late 1970s, when farmers were expanding and equipment was selling, and the future of American agriculture seemed to require continual investment in larger and more powerful machinery, had allowed Burl to maintain the certainty about his own judgment that had served him socially, even when it had not served him professionally. He had expanded his inventory. He had taken on debt to do it. He had made predictions about the equipment market that the market had not honored. By 1983, the dealership was carrying debt that the reduced sales could not service. And the conversations that Burl was having with Preston Yates at First National were the kinds of conversations that no longer contained the confident voice that had filled the Sedalia auction barn 12 years earlier. Harlan heard about this through the channels that small communities use for such information, the same channels that had carried the story of the $75 bull in the opposite direction, and he noted it with the same attention he brought to all information, filing it in the record he kept in his own mind, accurate and without embellishment. He did not discuss it. He did not point to it as evidence of anything. He had no need to point to it because he had never needed the external confirmation that other people's failures sometimes provided. He already knew what he knew. In the spring of 1985, the Sedalia Livestock Auction held its annual premium breeding sale on the second Saturday of April, the same day of year as the 1971 sale. The same barn, the same spring smell of the building that had been staging these events for decades. Harlan was consigning 4 bulls. They were the best animals he had produced in 14 years of breeding, the accumulated result of the selection program he had been running since Blank's first offspring had matured, each generation built on the best of the one, before each animal carrying a documented lineage that now traced through his own records back to the original bull he had paid $75 for in this same building on a morning when the whole raw room had found that price funny. He arrived early and took his seat in the back row. The same seat, the same corner, the same vantage point from which you could see everything without appearing to be looking at anything in particular. The barn was full in a way it had not been full in years. The Charolais market was at the peak of the cycle that Marcel had described in 1968, the breed now recognized across American agriculture as exactly what it was, the premium genetics sought by serious breeders from states that had not existed in Harlan's original calculations as potential customers. Buyers had come from Kansas and Nebraska and Oklahoma and Texas, men who had done the research and understood the bloodlines and driven the distances because the distances were worth driving. Harlan watched the early lots sell with the accumulated patience of 14 years of watching lots sell. He was thinking about many things. He was thinking about Marcel's letter, the careful English, the 5 pages, the single sentence about watching for Charolais at the local auctions, because most Americans would not recognize them yet. He was thinking about the coffee can on the tool shelf, $600 accumulated in small additions over 3 years. He was thinking about 3 weeks of November nights in 1972, and a woman who had set an alarm for 2 in the morning without being asked. He was thinking about the fence line and Ned Coulter's truck and the regular deliveries of community certainty about his mistake. He was not thinking about Burl Stanwyck. And then Burl Stanwyck walked through the door. Burl Stanwyck looked different. This was the first thing Harlan registered with the same precise attention he brought to everything he observed. The difference was not subtle. 14 years had done to Burl Stanwyck what 14 years does to a man when the current runs against him instead of with him, and the running had been hard and sustained and had left its accounting in visible ways. He was thinner than Harlan remembered the bulk of the early years, reduced to something that looked less like prosperity and more like a man carrying less than he had started with. The redness of his face had become a different kind of color, grayer at the edges, the color of a man whose confidence had been eroded by something more persistent than his defenses. He came through the door of the auction barn and stopped just inside it, looking around the room with the particular quality of someone assessing whether they are known and whether being known is welcome. The loud ease with which he had once entered rooms like this one, the automatic ownership of whatever space he occupied, was not present. In its place was something careful and diminished, the entrance of a man who has learned that not all rooms receive him the way rooms once did. Their eyes met across the barn. Harlan did not look away. He held the contact with the stillness of someone who has nothing to manage in the moment, no calculation to run, no position to establish. He just looked with the same steady patience that had characterized everything he had done in the 14 years since the last time he and Burl Stanwyck had been in this building together. Burl came through the crowd slowly. He moved with his head slightly lower than it used to move a man navigating a space he was no longer certain welcomed him. And when he reached the back row, he stopped beside the empty seat next to Harlan and looked at it and looked at Harlan and did not sit immediately. Harlan said nothing. Burl sat down. They were quiet for a while, both of them watching the auction ring, the lots moving through with the efficiency of a sale that had been running since 8 in the morning and knew its rhythm. The barn noise filled the space between them, the auctioneer's practiced cadence, and the response of the crowd, and the continuous undertone of men talking business in the rows and along the walls. "Been a while," Burl said. 14 years, Harlan said. "That is right. 14 years." Burl was looking at the ring, not at Harlan, watching the current lot with the attention of someone who needs something to look at while he organizes what he is going to say. He had the sale catalog in his hands, and he was not reading it. "I see your bulls are selling today," Burl said. "4 of them. What are you expecting to get?" Harlan looked at him for a moment. "Depends on the bidding," he said. 15,000 for the best one. Maybe more." Burl nodded slowly. The number settled into the space between them with a weight that both men understood. 15,000. Could be. Burl was quiet again. He turned a page in the catalog without reading it. "And that bull you bought in 71, he said. "The one I said would not last the summer," blank Harlan said. "He died last year, 14 years old. Good life for a bull. His bloodline," Burl said. Harlan gestured at the sale catalog in Burl's hands. 4 of his sons selling today. 23 of his grandsons on farms across Missouri. 200 head of registered Charolais in my breeding program. Every one of them tracing back to him. All from a $75 bull, Burl said. "That is right." The auctioneer called for a new lot, and the ring filled with a buyer's interest and then settled again as the lot resolved. Burl turned another unread page. When he spoke again, his voice was lower, the barn noise covering it so that only Harlan could hear. He said he owed Harlan an apology. Harlan said nothing. Burl said what he had done at that auction, what he had said, the standing up in front of the whole county and making a performance out of it. He had been wrong. He had been showing off. He had wanted to make the room laugh, and he had used Harlan to do it, and he had been wrong about the animal, and wrong about how he chose to announce that he was wrong. "You saw something nobody else saw," Burl said, "and I made you a laughingstock for it." "You did," Harlan said. The apology sat in the air between them. Harlan did not rush it. "I am sorry," Burl said. The words came out with the particular weight of words that have been carried a long distance and are finally being set down. The auctioneer's voice cut through the moment. He was announcing Lot 57. He was saying registered Charolais bull, 4 years old, sired by Maddox Blanc, documented bloodline tracing to original French imports. The name he used was wrong, close, but not quite, and Harlan did not correct it because names at auctions were often approximate, and it did not matter. What mattered was the animal that came into the ring. The bull was cream-colored like his father, but filled out in the way that Blanc at his best had only suggested the frame, that the breed promised fully realized the musculature deep and clean across the shoulders and hindquarters, the kind of animal that made men who understood cattle sit forward in their seats. The ring handlers had the ease of men managing something they respected. The auctioneer started at $8,000. Hands went up around the barn before the number was fully spoken. The Texas buyer in the front row, a Nebraska rancher in the middle section, 2 other buyers along the wall who had driven distances for exactly this kind of animal. 8, 9, often 12. Burl was watching the ring. $15,000. The Texas buyer voice level and certain, the voice of a man who has decided his price and is stating it. The barn went quiet in the way it goes quiet when a number has authority. The auctioneer asked for more. The question went around the room and found no response and came back unanswered. Going once, going twice. Sold for $15,000. Harlan made a small mark in the margin of his catalog. He did not look at Burl. He did not look around the room. The apology accepted, he said. Just like that. Burl turned to look at him. What else is there, Harlan said. You were wrong, I was right. 14 years have proved it. What more do you want me to do with it? Burl shook his head slowly. He said he had been running that day back through his mind for 14 years, trying to understand how Harlan had seen what none of them had seen, trying to understand how a man stands in a barn full of people laughing at him and says nothing and walks to the clerk's window and pays $75 and drives home without a word. I had help, Harlan said. What kind of help? A letter from France. My cousin Marcel, he worked in the cattle industry over there. He wrote to me about Charolais, told me what they were going to be worth, told me to watch for them at auctions because most Americans would not recognize them. Burl was very still. A letter, he said. That is all it was. A letter, Harlan said, and the willingness to read it carefully and do the research to find out if it was right. The breed associations were publishing articles. The livestock magazines were covering it. The knowledge was available to anyone who looked for it. But I did not look, Burl said. You already knew everything, Harlan said. The second of Harlan's bulls was entering the ring. This one went for $13,000 in a bidding sequence that took less than 2 minutes, the room responding to the animal with the efficient confidence of a market that has calibrated itself to what the genetics are worth. Burl watched it sell. He said he had lost the dealership. He said the bank was taking it the following month. 20 years of his working life, the business his father-in-law had built and handed to him on terms that had seemed generous at the time and had required more of him than he had known how to give. I made my choices, Burl said. Bought inventory I could not sell. Borrowed against a future that did not arrive the way I planned for it to arrive. I was wrong about that too. Harlan said nothing. I'm not asking for sympathy, Burl said. I made the choices, and the choices made the outcome, and that is how it goes. He was quiet for a moment. What are you going to do? Harlan asked. Burl looked at the ring where the third bull was being led in. He said he was 59 years old and he did not know anything but tractors and cattle, and the tractors had not worked out. He paused. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had done less physical work than he had originally been built for. I do not suppose you are hiring, he said. Harlan looked at him. This was the moment that the 14 years had been building toward, and Harlan understood it as such with the clarity of a man who has been patient long enough to recognize an arrival when it presents itself. He could say no. He had earned the right to say no with every mile of the 14 years, with every fence line visit from Ned Coulter, with every repetition of the Dead by July joke that had circulated through Pettis County, as if it were a permanent entry in the community's record of things it knew. He could say no and be entirely justified, and the justification would be understood by anyone who knew the history. He thought about his father on the porch. The two choices, the advantage kept or the knowledge shared. His father had framed it as a strategic question, a question about what served the man who knew something better than the men who did not. But there was a version of the question that his father had not articulated, or that Harlan had not understood at 16 the way he understood it now. There was what the advantage was worth when you kept it, and there was what it was worth when you extended it. Come out to the farm next week, Harlan said. I need someone to help with the spring breeding season. Does not pay much, but it is honest work. Burl looked at him with the expression of a man who has received something he was not prepared for and is not entirely sure what to do with it. Surprise and something more complicated moving together across his face. After everything I said, Burl started. That was 14 years ago, Harlan said. We have both gotten older. Maybe we have both gotten wiser. He looked at the ring where his third bull was building a strong bid from the floor. I am not offering you charity. I am offering you a job. Hard work. Early mornings. Cattle that do not care what you used to be. He turned back to Burl. You interested or not? Burl was quiet for a long moment. The auctioneer called the third bull sold at $11,000, and the number moved through the room and settled. I am interested, Burl said. Then I will see you Monday, Harlan said. 6 in the morning, do not be late. He turned back to the ring as his fourth and final bull came in, and he watched the bidding with the full attention of a man who has conducted his business and can now be present to the conclusion of it. The fourth bull sold for $12,000. $51,000 in one afternoon. From four animals that traced their lineage to a pale, skinny bull that a room full of people had offered to help bury for the cost of a shovel on an April morning 14 years ago, in this same building with the same spring smell in the air and the same Missouri light coming through the same high windows. Harlan made his final note in the catalog and closed it. He drove home. Burl Stanwyck arrived at the DeWitt farm the following Monday at 5:45 in the morning. Harlan was already at the barn when the headlights came down the lane, and he noted the early arrival without comment. It was information about the man filed in the accurate way. He put Burl to work immediately. Not at the complex work, not at the breeding program, management, or the bloodline documentation that required years of accumulated knowledge. He started him at the physical foundation of the operation, the daily feeding and watering and observation, the fundamental animal husbandry that was the ground floor of everything the breeding program was built on. Harlan showed him what to look for when he checked the animals each morning, the small indicators that a healthy animal presented, and the small indicators that a compromised one presented, the language of cattle that was learned through close daily contact over time, rather than through any instruction that could be compressed. Burl learned with the hunger of a man who has understood something important about what he does not know. He asked questions that were honest and direct, the questions of someone trying to fill a gap rather than establish a position, and Harlan answered them with the same economy he brought to everything, giving Burl what he needed to do the work without ornamentation. There was no ongoing conversation about the auction barn or the 14 years or the apology that had been offered and accepted. The past had been addressed and filed, and both men seemed to understand that continuing to work it was not what the present required. They were two men doing a job together, and the job had its own demands and its own satisfactions, and those were sufficient to fill the days. Cora watched this from a careful distance in the first weeks with the attention she had brought to everything on the farm since the November nights of 1972. She was not unfriendly to Burl. She was civil with the particular calibrated civility of a woman who has her own accounting of events and does not entirely share her husband's generosity of resolution, but who respects his judgment enough to follow his lead in the conduct of the household's relationships. Over time, her civility became something more comfortable, not warmth exactly, but the ordinary ease of people who work near each other long enough to develop the small courtesies of shared space. Burl ate lunch at the farm twice a week at Cora's kitchen table, and the lunches were quiet and functional, and gradually became slightly less quiet as the seasons accumulated, and the strangeness of the arrangement wore down to something that fit into the daily rhythm of the place. He learned about Charolais cattle. He learned about it the way Harlan had learned everything he valued, through sustained contact with the actual material handling the animals and observing their characteristics in building from observation to understanding rather than from instruction to application. He learned about carcass yield percentages and birth weight records and the bloodline documentation that made registered animals worth more than comparable unregistered ones. He learned the vocabulary of the breed that he had dismissed with a shovel joke on a spring morning. By 1986, he was managing the daily feeding program without supervision. By 1987, he was handling the preliminary evaluation of bulls for the annual sale, walking the animals with Harlan, and offering assessments that were increasingly accurate and useful. By 1988, Harlan gave him the title of assistant manager, not because the title meant anything in particular on a family farm, but because it accurately described what Burl had become. One evening in the late summer of 1988, they were sitting on the porch after a long day of sorting and moving cattle, the particular exhaustion of physical work that has been done well, settling into both of them, the farm quiet in the late light. Burl had a cup of coffee and was looking at the pasture where some of the breeding herd was visible along the fence line, pale against the green. He said that he had been thinking about what he had learned over the past 3 years. Harlan waited. Burl said he had learned that the things he had been most certain about were the things he had known least about. He said this simply and without self-pity, the flat observation of a man who has completed an accounting. He said that the day at the auction he had taken one look at the pale bull and decided. The deciding had taken less time than the announcing of the decision, and the announcing had been the loudest part of the whole business, and neither the deciding nor the announcing had contained any actual knowledge about what he was deciding about. Most people would have made the same mistake, Harlan said. Burl shook his head. Most people would have stayed in their seat. He looked at his coffee cup. I stood up. I turned around and played to the room. I made you into the joke because the room wanted a joke, and I was the kind of man who gave rooms what they wanted. He was quiet. That is what I cannot forgive myself for, he said. Not being wrong, everyone is wrong sometimes. It was being so loud about it, being so proud of it, making you the fool when you were the only one in the room who knew what he was looking at. The past is past, Harlan said. Is it? Burl looked out at the pasture. I remember that day like I was still in it. Remember the sound of my own voice carrying across the barn. Remember the whole room laughing. Remember watching you walk to the clerk's window and pay your $75 and not say a word. He turned to look at Harlan. What did you feel? When I said what I said and the room laughed, what did you actually feel? Harlan considered this with the honesty it deserved. He said he had felt something that was not quite anger and not quite contempt. He said he had felt the particular clarity of a man whose certainty has just been tested and has held. He said that everything Burl said and everything the room added to it had confirmed rather than challenged what he knew, because the laughter had shown him exactly how complete his advantage was, how invisible his knowledge was to the people around him, how many years of undisturbed building lay ahead. He said he had felt something very close to gratitude. Burl laughed, the genuine kind surprised out of him. Marcel wrote me something once, Harlan said. He said the man who knows something valuable has a choice. He can share it and everyone benefits, but no one owes him anything. Or he can use it and he benefits most, but he has to endure being misunderstood. He looked at the pasture. I chose to be misunderstood. I chose to wait. And now everyone understands. Burl nodded slowly. I spent 3 years of my life being certain I was right about your bull, he said, and 14 years knowing I was wrong about it. He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing. The 14 years were more useful than the 3. I just paid a higher price for them than I needed to. Harlan said nothing to this because nothing needed saying. They sat in the late summer quiet and watched the pale cattle move along the fence line in the Missouri evening light. Harlan DeWitt farmed his Pettis County ground for 32 years after that spring morning at the Sedalia auction. He built the DeWitt Charolais operation into a breeding program whose reputation extended through the Central States in the way that reputations extend when they are built on sustained quality rather than on promotion. He sold bulls to ranchers from Texas to Montana, and the bloodlines he had built from a $75 foundation animal spread through herds that he never visited and could not count. Blank's genetic legacy was in the final accounting beyond precise calculation. The direct offspring alone numbered in the hundreds across Missouri and the neighboring states. The crossbred calves, those offspring, had sired the premium that those calves had commanded at markets from Sedalia to Kansas City to beyond the improvement to the Pettis County beef herd that had gradually incorporated the genetics as other breeders followed the market's direction, all of it traced back through the documented records to a pale yearling that an auction barn full of experienced cattlemen had been unable to generate a $50 bid for. Cora lived to see the operation's full maturity, watching from the house and the porch and the edges of the pastures as the thing her husband had built, from patience and research and a letter from France, became the defining work of their life together. She had her own accounting of the 14 years, her own record of what they had cost and what they had produced, and it lived in her in the way that important things live in people who have been fully present to them. She told Clara once, her granddaughter, the girl who would eventually carry the operation into its 3rd generation, that the most important moment of the whole story was not the auction or the first premium calves or the 1985 sale. She said the most important moment was a February evening in 1972, when she had brought coffee out to the barn and stood at the fence next to Harlan while the sick bull stood in the holding pen, and she had asked him to tell her about the letter from France. Because that was when she understood that what Harlan was doing was not a bet or a gamble or a calculation about market timing. It was a thing he knew. And knowing the difference between those categories, she said, was the most useful thing she had learned in 50 years of marriage. Harlan died in 2003 at 79 years old on the farm where he had been born and had worked and had built something from patience that outlasted him. The service was at the Methodist Church in Sedalia, a modest gathering of the kind that a modest man produces the people who had actually known him rather than the people who had heard of him. Dr. Clifton Marsh came. He was very old and moved slowly and sat in the front with the stillness of a man who has been attending the funerals of people he respected for longer than he had expected to be doing it. Howard Krebs drove from Kansas, the rancher who had paid $1,200 for the first son of Blank and had shaken his head and laughed at the arithmetic of $75 and $1,200. He was old now, too, and sat in the middle rows with the quiet attention of someone honoring a man whose influence on his own operation was still present in the animals currently grazing 300 miles away. Burl Stanwyck sat at the end of the third row. He was 77 years old and had been retired from the DeWitt operation for 9 years, his body having reached the point where the early mornings and physical demands of the work were more than he could sustain. He had lived those years in the county, close enough to hear the periodic news of the breeding program's continued performance, and he had told the story of the 1971 auction to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear. It told it with the particular emphasis of a man who has had a long time to understand where the meaning in a story actually lives. He spoke at the service. He stood at the front of the church and looked out at the people who had come to honor Harlan DeWitt, and he said that he had known Earl Maddox for more than 50 years. He stopped. He corrected himself. Harlan DeWitt, he said. He had known Harlan DeWitt for more than 50 years. He said that for the first portion of those years, he had thought Harlan was a fool. He said he had been very certain about this, which was, as he had come to understand, entirely consistent with knowing nothing about the thing he was certain about. He told the auction barn story. He told it completely and without softening, the standing up, the turning to face the room, the shovel joke, the whole barn laughing, Harlan walking to the clerk's window in silence. He told it the way he had been telling it for years, with the full weight of the self-reproach that had become the story's honest freight. He said that Harlan DeWitt had built something from nothing, from a letter and 3 years of reading and a $75 bid on a pale, skinny animal that a room full of experienced men had unanimously dismissed. He said that the building had taken 14 years of patience and consistent work and the willingness to be wrong in public about something that Harlan knew privately he was right about. He said the loudest voice in the room is usually the most ignorant. He said real knowledge is quiet and patient and willing to wait as long as it needs to wait to be proved. He said that Harlan had taught him something about humility that he had not been ready to learn when he needed it and had spent the second half of his life trying to honor. He said that when Harlan had offered him a job in 1985, after everything, after 14 years of being wrong and being the instrument of public mockery directed at the one man in the county who had been right, he had not understood the offer. He had not known what to make of a man who could extend a hand across that distance. He said he had spent years trying to understand it and had eventually decided that understanding it was less important than being grateful for it. He held up a small cloth bag before he sat down, seeds visible through the cloth, and then he understood his mistake and put the bag down. He was at the wrong story. He said he had meant to say that he had brought something that had come from the DeWitt herd, one of the last recordings from the program's archive, and that he was going to give it to Clara to keep. Clara DeWitt was 28 years old and had been back on the farm for 3 years, learning the operation with the same proximity and patience method that the DeWitt men had always used to transfer what they knew. She was not a DeWitt by that name, but she carried the lineage of it in the ways that mattered in the eye for cattle and the patience for the long accumulation and the understanding of what her grandfather had understood about the relationship between knowledge and silence. She took over the operation after the service. In the barn office, on the shelf above the breeding records, in the registration papers, in the decades of accumulated documentation that certified the lineage of every animal the DeWitt program had produced, she hung a framed photograph. It showed Blank as a yearling, the photograph taken in the first summer after Harlan brought him home, the animal standing in the holding pen in the Missouri light, thin and pale and visibly not what the Pettis County cattle market recognized as a correct bull. Ribs showing, hip bones prominent, the picture of something that looked wrong to anyone who did not know what they were looking at. Below the photograph was a framed copy of Marcel Fontenot's letter, the original 5 pages in their careful English, the paper yellowed now and fragile at the folds, but the words still legible, still containing the sentence about watching for Charolais at the local auctions because most Americans would not recognize them yet. And below the letter, on a small brass plaque that Clara's father had commissioned years before, were 3 lines. Blanc, purchased 1971, $75, value of descendants, beyond calculation. And below that, in a different line, the words that Burl Stanwyck had spoken on Harlan's porch on a summer evening in 1988, which someone had heard and remembered and passed forward because they were worth keeping. The things we are most certain about are the things we know least about. Clara kept the record books the way Harlan had kept them, accurate and complete. She continued the breeding program with the same patient attention to selection, each generation built on the best of the one before. She knew the lineage the way Harlan had known it, not just in the documentation, but in the working familiarity of someone who has spent years handling the animals and learning to read them. Every spring, when she walked the pastures in the early Missouri light, checking the herd with the deliberate attention that the work required, she passed the place along the fence line where Ned Coulter had stopped his truck year after year to deliver the community's verdict on the pale calves that did not look right. She never thought about Ned Coulter when she passed that fence line. She thought about a man who had read a letter from France and done 3 years of research and driven 40 miles to an auction with $600 in his pocket and sat in the back row and waited for what he knew to arrive in the ring. She thought about a man who had sat in a barn full of laughter and said nothing, not because he had no response, but because the response that mattered was not the one you said with words. It was the one you said with 14 years. The herd moved through the Missouri morning pale against the green, the genetics tracing back through the documented record to a single yearling that had entered this ground worth $75 and had left it worth something that the ledger did not have a line for. The barn was where Harlan had always left it at the end of the day, in order. The records are complete, the work done, everything that needed to be said said.